going inside the issues of our community. This is Local 12 Newsmakers.
Good morning and welcome to Local 12 Newsmakers. Although most of the attention in the upcoming primary is focused on the presidential contest, particularly on the Democratic side, other local contests are at stake. The most important contested races revolve around the 2nd U.S. Congressional District. The 2nd District stretches through all or parts of 7 southeastern Ohio counties, including suburban eastern Hamilton County, southeast Warren County, and Claremont County, as well as rural and small town areas in Brown, Adams, Pike, and part of Scioto County. Although the current sprawling configuration of the district reflects redistricting after the 2000 census, this was a district where Republicans like Rob Portman won by comfortable margins of nearly 70%. Since Mr. Portman resigned his seat in 2005, the seat has been held by Gene Schmidt, who won in a special election in 2005 and then won in the November 2006 contest over Victoria Wulsin by a razor-thin margin of less than 3,000 votes out of 237,000 cast. This morning, we will devote the entire show to the 2 candidates in the Democratic primary in March 4th. Victoria Wulsin is a medical doctor who specializes in public health, general preventive medicine, and occupational medicine. She has worked in Cincinnati and 20 nations abroad. Steve Black is an attorney with Graydon, Head and Ritchie. He served for the decade on the Indian Hill City Council, including 4 years as mayor. Welcome to Newsmakers for both of you. Victoria, welcome back.
Thank you.
Thanks. A lot of issues here because these are now national issues more than just local issues. So let's range over a number of different things. All Democrats are impatient, upset with the way we got into Iraq, or almost all Democratic are impatient with the way that the Bush administration got us into Iraq and maybe the prosecution of the war there. But given where we stand now, Steve, let's begin with you. What is your view about what we should be doing from this moment forward in terms of taking our troops out and also in terms of whether or not any U.S. troops should be left there in a residual manner?
Dan, the first thing we have to do is announce an intention to withdraw our troops from Iraq. Until we tell the Iraqis that we are going to get out and stay out, they will not assume the burden of their own security.
Does that
and
include?
That's the first step we have to take.
Does that include announcing a date when we would start withdrawing troops?
It means that we have to tell them that we're leaving, and then we have to withdraw as fast as militarily feasible to get our troops out. And I would advocate that we get out of that country completely, not leave any residual troops there.
Victoria.
I agree, and I would, though, have dates both in terms of when we're going to start the withdrawal and our proposed timeline for completing the job. The experts say it'll take at least 16 months. That's reasonable because we do have to do it to maximize the safety, not only of our soldiers, but of the Iraqis.
What about if during that process, the warring factions in Iraq, Sunni, Shia, Kurds, others, begin to fight with each other in the midst of our withdrawal? What obligations do we have militarily to try to stabilize a situation that begins to deteriorate at that point? Victoria?
I think that we will have to be flexible as we make the plan for withdrawal because there may be things that come up that will change our plans. However, we know that the National Intelligence Estimate, the 9/11 Commission are all saying we'll be safer when we withdraw our troops from Iraq.
Steve?
I favor the Biden plan. That calls for setting up autonomous regional governments to govern those separate religious factions. And then we need to invoke the neighboring countries, Syria, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, to put economic pressure on these factions to stabilize the country.
That assumes that we have sort of an active diplomatic relationship and policy with those neighboring countries, which is problematic.
Which we desperately need now. We need to open up our diplomatic
So
channels.
a change of policy of the Bush policy on that front.
A change of administration to a different administration is what we need.
Victoria?
Yeah, I totally agree that we do need to strengthen our relations, not only with our allies, but certainly with our so-called enemies in the region. It's the only way that we're going to be able to regain our authority of any kind. And in terms of rebuilding Iraq with the different factions, I know that it's possible when there is a concerted and sincere multinational effort. In Rwanda, for example, after a civil war that was just as bad as Iraq, I was part of a team paid for by the United States Agency for International Development, paid for by UNICEF, by the United Nations, coming together so that we could help rebuild the country. We can do that in Iraq if we have the will to rebuild Iraq and bring our troops home safely.
Do we owe anything special to the many Iraqis who have worked with and for U.S. troops and interests there? We have been very restrictive on the number of Iraqis who can come into the United States. Do we need to change that policy as we begin this withdrawal? Victoria?
I think that we do owe something to the Iraqis who have been working with us. And as we
including allowing them to emigrate to the United States?
I think our whole immigration system will have to be looked at under a new administration and a new Congress, and I think that that should be one of the things we look at.
Steve?
I think the Iraqis have to fend for themselves. I think that they need to form governments, as I say, regional governments, and find a place for them to fit into the modern Iraq.
Let's switch over to the issue of the economy, which is certainly jobs. The economy has become, if probably the dominant issue here in the presidential campaigns anyway. In a state like Ohio, which has lost so many industrial jobs, manufacturing jobs, Democrats love to rail against, and both of you have said things about NAFTA and CAFTA, and talk about, you know, having really fair trade rather than this open trade. But concretely, in a global economy, what would you do with an agreement like NAFTA, either retrofitting it or moving into the future with that or other things? Steve?
I would take NAFTA and amend it so that we have some standards on the goods that we import. The reason why it's so tough on our workers is that the imported goods don't have labor standards, they don't have environmental standards, they don't have worker safety standards. So the foreigners can produce all these goods without these standards and send them into our market to compete against our goods that are produced under all these terribly restrictive conditions. We need to level that playing field. We need to have the same conditions apply on foreign goods that apply to us.
I would say that the first concrete steps to take would be to revise the tax structure so that we actually give incentives to industries that are going to create and maintain good paying jobs right here in Southern Ohio, rather than subsidizing companies that are outsourcing jobs abroad.
Give me concrete. What would that look like? What could you change the tax structure, and how would that change the dynamics of what we see in the marketplace in Southeast Ohio right now, or Southwest Ohio right now? How would that change things?
Those are two questions. One is, how would we do it and how would it change things?
Well, what would you do,
Okay.
and how would you I mean, it's nice to say the
Concretizing.
principles, but give me a concrete examples of where the tax structure is interfering with companies staying, and how you would change it.
Let me give an example. If you're going to, if there's a multinational company that's going to hire people in India, say, and in India they don't have to get health benefits, but here in Ohio they do, we should make sure that that's comparable, and we can make it by law, and if it's not feasible by actual bottom line, you add taxes to the situation.
Steve?
I don't think we can force foreign countries to change their healthcare systems for imports. But I do think that we can make them comply with our environmental standards. We've got a huge problem with global warming, and if we allow the Chinese to ship us goods that are produced in an economy where they're worsening our global warming problem, well, I think we're making a terrible mistake. I think we need to insist that the Chinese cap their carbon emissions just as we're going to have to cap our
just
carbon
as we're
emissions.
going to have to, but we've been a nation that has resisted. We dropped out of the Kyoto Accords, and we have resisted and only been drugs kicking and screaming into this.
Change is coming. Believe me, change is coming in this country.
Victoria, on this global warming, as long as we've got there, it's not exactly the way I thought, but that's okay.
Yep.
What should the United States and the next Congress and the next president, who will be different no matter which party,
Yep.
What should we be doing? What kinds of things on this carbon and global
Great.
warming question?
I would say at least three quick things. We need to end our dependence on fossil fuels and specifically on Middle Eastern oil. That's going to make a big difference for jobs, therefore the economy, for ecology,
How do
and
we
for
end
security.
it? How do we end it?
By investing right here in alternative and renewable energy sources.
Like
Wind, like sun, like agriculture. We're at the beginning of research and development of renewable resources. We've been spending 100 years in research in how to use fossil fuels. So we need to change the actual energy sources. We need to decrease consumption. For example, making sure cars have higher miles per gallon regulations. And we need to do a cap and trade system whereby industry cannot emit more carbon.
Part of the problem is that a lot of those alternative systems aren't competitive with still relatively inexpensive traditional systems. Are you willing to put, say, extra gas tax on to make other kinds of fuels more marketable, more competitive in the marketplace?
Certainly I wouldn't start there. I would start with making sure that if we're giving any benefits to the big oil companies, whether it's through tax abatements or import standards, that those have to switch to be invested in renewable resources.
Steve?
I'm not for a gas tax under any circumstances. I think that's punitive to the people who live in our rural counties. You know, our district stretches clear to Portsmouth.
Right.
And there are plenty of people on the small farms who have taken second jobs, and they have to drive miles to work. And if we raise their gas prices, we're punishing their lifestyle. We cannot afford to do that. What we need is an energy policy in this country that supports the creation of renewable energy sources, alternative fuels, and we need tax incentives for our companies to research and develop those.
Something else you have in your
sources.
district as it stretches down upriver as you move east is a lot of coal-fired plants, which have all sorts of carbon implications. Some of the older plants, Beckjord, for example, are not the cleanest at all in the world, so there's a lot of implications there. But also the coal that is used to fuel those plants comes from mountaintop removal in Kentucky and West Virginia. From a U.S. energy policy and environmental policy, what do you do about coal production, which your district is very much tied to? Steve?
Number one, I'm very much against coal production by strip mining. I think that's a terrible waste of our natural resources. Number two, the best thing we can do to remove the pressure on these coal-fired plants is to cut our consumption. A kilowatt saved is as good as a kilowatt generated. So there's no way we ought to be expanding coal-fired production. We simply ought to look for alternative sources of energy.
Victoria?
I would agree that our environment has to come first, because if we destroy that, we have no future. And in terms of investing in the alternatives, we know that already Governor Strickland has begun investing in wind and solar and agricultural energy.
Last quick question here before we go to a break. Where do you stand on investigating nuclear power plant in your district?
I certainly believe that we should investigate nuclear power. Now, we don't have a nuclear power plant in our district.
Well, but you could.
Well,
in the future.
Okay, I don't think we should go there.
Steve?
I think we need a national policy on the disposal of atomic waste. The biggest problem we have in this country is that everyone needs nuclear power. Nobody knows what to do with the waste. That ought to be Congress's first priority. Figure out what to do with nuclear waste, and then maybe we can transition to the situation France has, where they are totally independent of foreign oil because they produce enough nuclear power to be that way. We only produce 20% of our electricity from nuclear sources. We need to move that up, but with a policy.
Okay, I need to take a break, so stay right there. Stay tuned. After the break, we will return to discuss health care and lots of other issues. Welcome back. I'm joined this morning by the two candidates for the Democratic nomination for the Ohio 2nd Congressional District, Victoria Wulsin and Steve Black. And as we continue here, something that affects everybody and that the Congress is going to have to take a look at is the No Child Left Behind in our educational policy. From a Democratic perspective, what do you think about No Child Left Behind, and does it need to be modified? And it's a sort of a secondary question, does the United States need to have standards that go nationally so that the tests that are being taken in New York State, Ohio, and Mississippi are the same, and we get rid of these different standards in different states? Victoria, let's start with you.
The No Child Left Behind program has not succeeded the way we had hoped. Although we need to hold schools and the teachers accountable, what has evolved is a teaching to the test, which is not stimulating the kind of creative and intelligent students that we want.
So what should Congress do?
I think that we should, first of all, revamp it completely. Are there ways to keep teachers accountable? Yes, but we've got to allow more local control. And as we improve No Child Left Behind, we also have to look at it in the context of the whole educational system. Why don't we get more children into Head Start? Why don't we make sure that college education is affordable through grants and scholarships? Why aren't we investing more in science and technology? All of those things are part of not only holding a school accountable, but also the whole educational system.
Steve.
I'll go further. I think we ought to repeal No Child Left Behind. And I say that having a daughter who taught 5 years in public schools and who has had the pressure of trying to teach to the test instead of teaching things that matter to children. How to be a good learner, how to love science, how to love to read, how to be, a good person.
Do you worry, though, that then there aren't any standards, and because that's where the No Child Left Behind came from, the fear that things weren't happening?
True, but it created an unfunded mandate. That's the problem with it. I think it's fine for the federal government to set standards which are expectations, but it's up to the states to fulfill the educational role, and they shouldn't be doing that by putting pressure on just the teachers. We need to put pressure on the school principals. We need to put pressure on the parents. We need to improve the early childhood education. Head Start is one of the greatest investments we've made in our educational system, and if these kids aren't ready to learn when they hit first grade, it's not going to matter what standards we insist on in fourth grade.
Let's take a look at the issue of health care, which is one of the big defining issues in the campaign on any level this year. All Democrats are for more people having health care, so okay, that's enough said on that. The problem is how to do this. Do you believe that in the long run, that the way the United States organizes this, where employers are the basic funder of healthcare programs, is this the way to the future? Is this what we're going to be with 10, 15 years from now? And if not, how do we change it? Steve?
Not if I'm in Congress will employer health care continue that long, Dan. It's a historical accident that our country has relied on employers to provide health care. That started after the Second World War when...
What's the alternative?
The alternative is moving incrementally into a plan that provides health insurance to everyone, makes it equal access to everyone, and provides for essentially a government-sponsored plan. And we have to do that in an evolutionary manner to slowly move our private insurance companies that are making millions of dollars off of us. We have to move them out of the picture.
Victoria.
I think we need to look at the experiences and successes of a variety of different kinds of health care systems. We know that the single-payer systems of Canada and the UK have some advantages. An employer-based system, which is predominantly what we have now, has some advantages. However, it's more important to look at how economic our system is. And right now, because it is so dominated by insurance companies, where our healthcare dollar is being spent denying privileges, denying services, rather than...
How do you
paying
change
for
that?
drugs. Oh, well, we change it by getting competitive. And how we do that is by putting the private insurers in direct competition with a government program like SCHIP. As we expand SCHIP, which we certainly should have done, and as you know, our current representative voted against it, we're going to provide more efficient health care to children with more focus on prevention and primary care, and that's going to be less costly than the private insurance that they might otherwise have.
But in the long run, you believe that multiple insurance companies still make sense, and just you want to increase the competition.
No, I would say in the short run. In the short run, that's what I think where we are and where we need to be. However, I think in the long run, what we're going to find is that the private insurance companies are not going to stay profitable, and so they will be eased out.
One of these real short questions here on Medicare Part D. Right now, according to congressional rules, the government can't negotiate to get the lowest possible price. That's something Congress could change.
Right.
Would you support a change in that?
Yes.
Steve?
Yes.
Okay.
Big time.
That makes that pretty simple. Okay, a couple of things here. Steve, you historically and your family were a Republican. You say at various places that you became very frustrated with the Bush administration and moved over to the Democratic Party. The Republican Party now has nominated a maverick for McCain for president, or almost nominated him. And what's to say you won't sort of migrate back to the Republican Party?
Dan, I'm a person of principle. I have always believed that the government ought to serve the American people, that people who work hard and play by the rules ought to be able to put food on the table and get ahead, and that our government ought to respect the rule of law, and that it ought to enforce non-discrimination. Now, with those principles, I'm going to stay true to that, and that's what I've been true to my whole life. You know, I had a choice between maintaining those principles and changing parties, or giving up the principles and keeping my Republican Party. I chose to keep my principles and
do you find yourself
be
comfortable in the Democratic Party?
I do, Dan. There are plenty of Democrats out there, and I'm knocking on doors and finding them every day who are very glad I'm in this race.
May I comment, though, on you're saying you're a man of principle, Steve, because you're running for office to represent people, and yet you yourself take a tax cut on your property as though it were a farm, thereby raising the taxes of people all around you. That exemption, as you know, was meant for farmers.
Now, Dan,
furthermore, you say...
Okay, Victoria?
Yes.
Let's let Steve, I'm going to run out of time, and I want to let Steve respond to that.
Dan,
this is because of the Indian Hill situation in the large plots.
That's
yes.
right. Dan, I'm being attacked by a herd of sheep here, and...
No, just answer the question.
Okay,
now.
the answer is I have a farm. It's been in my family for 80 years. My mother and I own 28 acres. We produce farm goods hay and garden vegetables
Okay.
with a professional farmer who's lived on the property for 50 years.
Okay, I'm almost out of time. So you're saying that you do run a farm and therefore have a right to the tax
I
break.
am the
Okay.
stereotypical example of why that was created, to protect the family farm.
Okay, I'm going to be running out of time.
Sure.
Victoria,
Yes.
for you,
Yes.
this district has traditionally been a Republican district. Can you represent this district and be a good spokesperson in Washington? We only have about 30 seconds.
Absolutely. Obviously, the 49.4% of the people have already chosen me, have said, yes, you can do it. Second of all, the people in the district like what I offer in terms of health care, in terms of bringing our troops home, and that those are principles that transcend any party line.
Okay, thank you very much. For additional information, you can check out the websites of both candidates, and you can see them on screen, WulsinForCongress.com, SteveBlackForCongress.com. And I want to thank the two guests. I know we ran out of time here. Thank you for making Newsmakers a part of your Sunday morning. Next week, the candidates for the Republican nomination for the 2nd Congressional District, Gene Schmidt and Tom Brinkman. Have a good week.